Let's go to another question on the ontological argument. Dr. Craig, are the Anselmian ontological arguments and Descartes' variations sound? As a Christian, I believe they have a lot of strength to them, though Aquinas did disagree, the reader says. But there are some solid objections, most notably Kant and Douglas Gasking. Gasking's anti-argument is also interesting. It says, number one, the creation of the world is the most marvelous achievement imaginable. Number two, the merit of an achievement is the product of A, its intrinsic quality, and B, the ability of its creator. Number three, the greater the disability or handicap of the creator, the more impressive the achievement. Number four, the most formidable handicap for a creator would be non-existence. Number five, therefore, if we suppose that the universe is the product of an existent creator, we can conceive a greater being, namely one who created everything while not existing. Number six, I'm looking at the look on your face. Number six, therefore God does not exist.
Oh, this is just so sad to see this kind of drivel propounded on the internet. The idea of a being which creates something while he doesn't exist is logically impossible. There is no possible world in which a being does not exist and yet creates something. In order to create something, you have to exist. So, in fact, there is no possible world at all in which a certain being exists and doesn't exist. This is just nonsense. So it doesn't undermine the ontological argument to posit something that's metaphysically incoherent. The idea is that God is the greatest conceivable or metaphysically possible being, and that isn't in any way called into question by postulating nonsense and metaphysical impossibilities.
What do you think about premise number three, which seems to be kind of the crucial premise?
Well, that's not the crucial premise, though. The crucial premise is five, that if we suppose the universe is the product of an existent creator, we can conceive of a greater being, namely one who created everything while not existing. That is not a greater concept. That's nonsense. That's metaphysically incoherent to talk about a being who created everything while not existing.
Okay, so number five is crucial. What do you think about number three? The greater the disability or handicap of the creator, the more impressive the achievement. A person who has no arms that paints by holding the brush in their toes, we laud as a great achievement. Seems like this argument is trying to establish something there.
Well, that doesn't seem to make sense because he says the merit of an achievement is a combination or product of its intrinsic quality and the ability of its creator. And if you decrease the ability of its creator, maybe you could say that increases its intrinsic quality or something. But yeah, he doesn't define what he means by more impressive. But I think this is all not germane anyway, because as I say, the argument is worthless. It's based on a logical incoherence. Finally, the last argument to be discussed is the ontological argument. And the version that I've presented comes from Alvin Plantinga. Now, let's simply summarize the argument. It's possible that a maximally great being, or God, exists. A maximally great being is a being which is omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect in every logically possible world. Two, if it's possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. Three, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. That's true by definition because part of maximal greatness is to exist, pardon me, in every logically possible world. Four, if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. Five, if a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. Six, therefore, a maximally great being exists. Now, steps 2 through 6 of this argument are relatively uncontroversial. Most philosophers will agree that if God's existence is even possible, then it follows that God must exist. So the real primary issue to be settled is what grounds exist for thinking the premise 1, that it's possible that a maximally great being exists, is true. Now, Dawkins devotes 6 full pages brimming with ridicule and invective to the ontological argument. But he does so without raising any serious objection to Plantinga's ontological argument. He reiterates a parody of the argument, which is designed to show that God does not exist. Because he says a God who created everything while not existing is greater than a God who created everything while existing. And therefore, this proves that God does not exist, because a God who could create everything while not existing is greater and therefore would be maximally great. Now, ironically, this parody, far from undermining the argument, actually reinforces it. For think about it. A being which creates everything while not existing is logically incoherent and therefore impossible. There is no possible world in which a non-existent being exists. Right? That's logically incoherent. So there is no possible world in which a non-existent being exists and creates everything else. So that his parody is based upon a logical incoherence. Such a being isn't possible and therefore doesn't exist in any possible world. So what the atheist has to maintain is that the concept of a maximally great being is similarly logically incoherent. It has to be like the concept of a married bachelor or a round square. But the problem is that it's not like that. There's nothing incoherent about the idea of a being which is omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect, and exists in every logically possible world. That seems to be a perfectly coherent conception, and therefore that actually supports the truth of premise 1, that it's possible that a maximally great being exists. Dawkins also chortles, I've forgotten the details, but I once piqued a gathering of theologians and philosophers by adapting the ontological argument to prove that pigs can fly. They felt the need to resort to modal logic to prove that I was wrong. Now, folks, this is just embarrassing. The ontological argument just is an exercise in modal logic. Modal logic is the logic of the possible and the necessary. This just is a demonstration in modal logic. So I can just imagine Dawkins making a fool of himself at this professional conference with this spurious parody in the same way that he embarrassed himself with his flyweight objection to the teleological argument in the face of correction by eminent philosophers and theologians. Well, I'm over time at this point. I'm sure that you can think of substantive objections or questions to the arguments that I presented. But at least I hope to have shown this morning that the objections raised by Richard Dawkins, and therefore by the new atheists in general, to these traditional arguments for God's existence are not even injurious, much less deadly.